Julian, you better watch what you're going to say.
Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another one of our series of seminars that we're holding within the International Barley Hub. We have much pleasure in welcoming Julian to be our speaker, Julian South, to be our speaker today. And Julian is going to talk about the Magb and malting industry, and will be delivered by Julian. So Julian's just going to give us a bit more information on that. Julian is a graduate of Newcastle University and studied a PhD in Strathclyde, and also worked with Heriot Watt and SCRI, which was the predecessor of James Hutton. So Julian was an ex-employee of us. Julian's career started with research in sugar beet, and then he moved on to the brewing industry with Allied Breweries before taking up positions with ADAS, Cadbury Schweppes, and then he took the head chemistry role at Cameron BRI. Julian joined Magb as an executive director in 2016. So Julian, I'm just going to hand it over to you. Can I remind you that this is being recorded, and if anybody doesn't want to be shown on screen, to make sure your video camera stays off. And if you have any questions, put them in the chat, and Robbie or I will pick up them as we go along, and we will have the questions at the end. So Julian, over to you.
Okay, thanks, George. Right, the technical bit, which is to put my slides up. I shall do that. Is that showing as people would like to see?
Yeah, that's great.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, thanks, George, for the introduction, and thanks to everybody for signing up in what I hope is a talk that will keep you entertained at least for the next 30 minutes. And I'm looking forward to a good question and discussion session afterwards. So what I'm hoping to do is to bridge the gap between growing barley and brewing and distilling. And I think most people here will know a fair bit about growing barley, hopefully a little bit about brewing and distilling. And my guess is that most people will know a little less about malting. Malting is a lesser known step in the supply chain. So I'll start with a little bit about myself. So as George said, I'm a plant scientist, and I started my career in university research, and that was mostly looking at barley starch. I still have a big interest in barley starch, but unfortunately it's more technological than scientific these days. So I had an opportunity to join the brewing industry, and I've never really looked back. It's been a fantastic time working in all areas of the supply chain. Aside from work, I'm a very avid home brewer and a beer creator, and I have a special interest in recipe development. And you'll see a picture here of me behind on the wrong side of the bar, telling this barman what he needs to do to make a clear pint. That was one of my first tasks in brewing. Nowadays, of course, a clear pint has been superseded with many cloudy pints, so we have to be careful what we say. So the presentation, I want to talk about what malt is, what malting is, and some of the key steps in malting, a bit about the malting industry, and finally what the Magb is and how we're helping the malting industry. So I'll start with malt. Malt actually looks quite a lot like barley, and you could be forgiven for thinking that not much has happened to the barley once it comes out at the other end of the maltings. But if you taste it, and one of the things you often get brewers to do is to taste it, it's actually quite friable, and it has a very pleasant taste and aroma. It needs to be milled, and a lot of small brewers would recognize the milled barley as the milled malt as their key raw material. But a lot of big brewers would take it in whole corns and would mill it in a pretty specialized milling process. And this is what we call pale or white malts. The malting process consists of 3 key steps. So the first step is steeping. And this is a repeated immersion in water, typically 2 days. and we're looking to hydrate the grain from 14 to around about sort of 44 to 46% moisture. Typically, this would involve 2 immersions in water and then air rests in between. Occasionally, you may find 3 immersions, but for water conservation reasons, maltsters typically use 2. And there may also be CO2 extraction because you don't want to asphyxiate the grain. The second step is germination. So at this point, the grain is going to grow. This would last typically between 4 and 6 days. You would turn the grain so that it doesn't mat together as the rootlets grow. You may also aerate the grain in order to keep it cool because it does generate its own heat as it germinates. Then the final step is kilning. And the kilning step is usually sort of up to 2 days. It will be dried at temperature between 90 and 105 degrees. It's a very energy intensive step, and this is where you would develop a lot of flavour and colour, and it's a key step for the maltster. You would also then screen the malt to remove the rootlets and the excess acrospires, and then it would be sent to store. Now there are 5 main reasons why the maltster wants to malt. The first one is to maximise the potential hot water extract, which ultimately becomes sugars and then alcohol for the brewer or the distiller. Secondly, for yeast growth in order to produce small peptides, soluble proteins and amino acids. You'd want to develop flavour and colour. You'd also want to degrade some of the troublesome cell walls and other materials that would cause problems in brewing. And finally, you need a stable product because often malt is prepared and it's stored for some time before it may be used at the next part with the brewing or the distilling process. So there's lots of physiology, lots of biochemistry. So that's a nice dissected corn showing a white endosperm. The embryo is red. That's because it's been stained with a tetrazolium stain. And I'm not going to talk about biochemistry and physiology. This is just a short advert for the next seminar in series, which is on June the 16th at 2 o'clock. So that's a very nice hand-drawn malting picture, which we often use when we're at trade shows and other events. So that shows a few extra processes. So when the barley arrives, you've got to put it into store. You need to screen it, and often you need to dry it before it can go into relatively long-term storage. So you may take barley and keep it several months before it actually goes for malting. The steep tanks in this picture are conical steeps. I'll talk more about steeping in a bit, but there are other forms. And then there's a germination vessel there, which also doubles as a kiln. And finally, there's a malt storage and a dispatch area. So that's beginning to look more like what a maltings actually looks like. Okay, let's reflect a bit on the history of malting, because that sort of is quite interesting. So malting was a very early biotechnology, possibly the earliest, and its origins go back at least 8,000 years. Some people would say further, possibly even 12,000 years. The basic process has been unchanged throughout most of history, and the Egyptians were reputed to have used wicker baskets suspended in wells to hydrate grain. Later on, dedicated buildings would have been used, and these may have had stone floors and stone walls, and the idea there would be to try and control the temperature in some way. And they may have also had separate kiln facilities. So and until recent times, malting was actually quite small and quite localized with local barley. There would have been a very large number of maltings indeed. From the 1800s onwards, you start to get purpose-built maltings with relatively shallow grain beds, and often these would have been alongside canals or railways for transport to brewers. As brewers were growing in size, maltings needed to supply a larger number of batches of grain, and they would have been very labor intensive. But at the 20th century, so around about the Industrial Revolution, mechanized maltings were introduced, and we start to see pneumatic aeration and a very large increase in scale. That's what a floor maltings looks like typically. This is Warminster in Wiltshire, and there are a number of these floor maltings today, 3 in England and a further 7 or 8 in Scotland. And up to the 20th century, most malting was done in this way. And the sort of scale, you're talking about sort of tens of tons at a time. So barley would have been steeped in separate tanks and spread on this shallow bed. It would have been turned by hand, as you can see happening in this picture, using rakes. And this would have been a way to prevent matting of the grain. The only temperature control really was to open and shut the windows. So the windows have got louvers, which can be automated in response to the temperature, and it's a pretty long germination. The grain is then transferred in a manual way to a separate kiln. There are floor maltings which have endeavoured to mechanize some of the operations, but the majority are run on sort of by hand. So the total tonnage of floor malt in the UK is pretty small in relation to the sort of total tonnage of malt produced altogether. And often specialised barley varieties might be used, and this is where, for example, Maris Otter would largely be processed. The outside appearance of a floor maltings is fairly typical as well, and you can see the kiln at the bottom end, and you can see the louvers on the side of the building. And up and down the country there are a number of buildings like this which have been preserved. This again is Warminster, and it's a fantastic preservation. Okay, so contrast floor malting with industrial scale malting. So this is Munton's plant at Stowmarket in Suffolk. The first thing you can see, just get the pointer. First thing you can see is there are a large number of silos, and this reflects the large intake of grain and the large quantities of malt that might be maintained. The large number of buildings here partially reflects the fact that there's a malt extract plant on site, but this is not untypical for the size of a site for modern maltings. The other thing to note is there's an effluent plant at the bottom of the site, there's a large amount of effluent from a maltings, and in order to sort of efficiently produce that, it's better to have an effluent plant on site. And in this case, there's even a production of biogas, which goes back into the maltings to fuel the process. There's another maltings, and this is Simpson's in Berwick-on-Tweed, and this is by the coast. There's a fair number of maltings that are actually by the coast, and you have the round germination vessels at the bottom here. Again, you've got an effluent plant, large silo block, and a number of different buildings, each of which houses a maltings of a particular design. Okay, let's look at the sort of different parts of the process. So steeping, often quite commonly in stainless steel conical vessels. These would be typically between 30 and 50 tons, and a number of the steep vessels would dispense into a single germination vessel. So there is a limit to the size of the conicals. So you can get flat bottom steeps as an alternative, and these are often much larger, and they can also be made in concrete, which can be quite an efficient way to build them. It's my only video which is showing the grain being aerated and circulated in the steep. I hope this plays. That's probably the most exciting part of the process to watch. Most of the I mean, watching germination is great, but you'll have to stand there for an awful long time. So boxes. So there are different forms of germination vessels. So the first one is boxes. So these were known as often known as Saladin boxes, after Charles Saladin in the late 1800s. They're often a metre in depth, and grain is turned mechanically. They vary in size from 25 to typically 280 tons, and they're pretty popular in the UK. They're very simple to turn with a vertical screw turner, and you can often share that screw turner between different boxes, so it can be quite efficient. And they're also pretty simple to construct in concrete, so these have become very popular in this country. The next type of germination vessel is a drum. These are typically with capacities from 10 to 50 tons. They were first produced actually quite a long time ago in the 1870s by the Belgian Galland, commonly specified in maltings between the 1920s and the 1960s, and they're actually quite substantial in construction. So they've lasted a long time, and there's a lot of heavy engineering, a lot of manual sort of maintenance that takes place, but they've been pretty good. They require no special germination building, so all of the special conditions are inside the drum, as opposed to the box, which requires a building which would be resistant to humidity and higher temperatures. And drums produce pretty good homogeneous malt growth and malt quality, and there's a fair number of drum plants in operation across the countries. Thirdly, and this is where we get into what would be regarded as the most modern design, and this is the circular maltings. So these generally have much bigger capacities, so they can range from between 50 and in some cases up to 600 tons batch size. They can be constructed in stainless steel or in concrete, and they can be placed on top of each other in a tower design, which is a very efficient way to use the footprint on a malting site. So they're relatively easy to load and can be turned and stripped pretty much automatically, and they have a large plenum or space underneath the floor, which gives good airflow and good access for cleaning. So you can also integrate the germination with the kilning in the circular maltings. So this is the last one I showed you was quite small. This is quite large. So this is at Arbroath, and you can see the depth here is sort of typically up to 2 meters, and you've got a whole series of screws which would turn the grain, and in this case the floor moves as opposed to the screw turners, and you can and that's a very efficient way of using the engineering. So this shows the arrangement of the circular maltings and the flow of air. So the fresh air is mixed with air from the germinating grain that can be humidified, and a series of louvers can be automated to maintain just the right temperature and just the right airflow. So that's a pretty common design. It's also possible, of course, to put tube heat exchangers in so that the kilning can take place in the same vessel, which is a very efficient way of using equipment. So kiln, there's much variation in kiln design, but a common requirement is a bed depth, typically of between 1 meter and 2 meters, preferably a meter. And the reason for this is because you do have a gradient in drying across the bed. Modern kilns are typically round, and they're often fired with indirect heating, and there's a system of heat recovery in order to reduce energy wastage, because the kilning step is an exceptionally high energy intensive step. There's a lot of science and a lot of engineering in kilning, and this is a pretty critical step for controlling malt quality. There's also a lot of engineering design and a lot of opportunity to utilize new technologies, and things in the future that we might see are things like microwave drying or ultrasonic technologies. But at the moment, the majority of technology is fairly traditional heat. So most malt is known as pale or white malt for obvious reasons, but there are many specialty malts which are produced for flavour, colour and other purposes. And a huge range is now available for brewers, and even distillers are starting to experiment with specialty malts. So coloured malts need special roasting equipment, and this is usually a rotating drum, very similar to coffee or cocoa roasters. And even some of the flavours are similar to what you get when you roast coffee or roast cocoa. So the drum operates at a higher temperature than a normal malt kiln, and it uses a lot of dry heat to create very dark malts. You can also roast cereals directly without malting, And a good example is roasted barley, which is used for stouts, including that very popular stout from Ireland. Other stouts are available. Dark malts are made by a number of malting companies, but one company specializes in just dark malts. There is a very good market at the moment for dark malts with the sort of popularity of dark beer styles. So a quick mention of a few other specialist malts. One is a high diastatic malt. So this is often used in whiskey, grain whiskey production. Often prepared with 6-row barley, and you may use a lower kilning temperature to preserve some of the enzyme activity. Then there's crystal malt. Crystal malt is basically a germinated barley that's stewed at a lower temperature, typically around 60 degrees. So it's below normal kilning temperature. And this creates sort of toffee-like flavors and gives a deeper, sort of more subtle colors, and a range of crystal malts available, which can be sort of used to create a whole range of different beers. And thirdly, wheat malt. And wheat malt is typically used for Weiss beers, as you would expect. So this would give an enhanced foam and a sort of typical sort of spicy type colours and spicy type flavours, and then just a subtle colour. But there are scores of different special malts, and if you just browse the malting industry websites, you find huge numbers of some traditional and some new styles. I did feel it's important to mention peated malt, and this is a key special malt which is obviously used to produce peated whiskey. So this is a mound of peat which is ready to go to a maltings, and it's extracted from specially prepared peat bogs. Now, there is much discussion about the sourcing of peat, and this is an area where we work as Magb closely with government to ensure a continued supply. And the popularity of peated whiskey, is increasing. We need to keep a continued supply of peated malt to deliver that. So the amount of peat extracted for malting is actually pretty small by comparison with the total amount which is taken, most of which goes for horticulture, and then a small amount for burning in holiday cottages as a fuel source. So you can extract peat in a sustainable manner, and there is a concern that legislation may be brought in which limits the future supply. So we're working pretty closely with particularly Scottish Government to ensure that there is a continued supply. Traditionally, the practice of using peat was as a heating fuel, and it was burned directly in the malt kiln, and that was done because it was the readily available fuel source. But this is a particularly inefficient way to impact peaty flavours on malt, and it's very wasteful for the amount of peat that's extracted. So mostly what people would do today would be to create a peaty smoke in a dedicated smoking vessel, and then that would be allowed to permeate the malt bed while the malt is being kilned. And the flavours are much more intense and much less peat is needed. There is an active programme of research at the Scotch Whisky Research Institute to understand the science behind peating and the generation of the specific flavours that are produced. And a lot of the work is aimed at how to use less peat and how to produce a consistent phenolic flavour profile. Brief mention of malt extracts, and sort of compliments to Moltings that supplied me with this slide. These are some of the products in which malt extracts are used. I know as a Barley Hub we should think about food as much as drink, and so malt extracts are created by just a few malting companies, and these provide either liquid or flour, sort of powdered ingredients that go into many of the well-known brands. So they're made generally by brewing up a sweet wort and then drying it and concentrating it into either a syrup or a flour. And the resultant product has a really nice malty flavour, and most of us probably remember from our childhood malt extract in the kitchen cupboard. Malt extracts is also a really good flavour enhancer in many foods, and for a small amount of malt extract you can actually get a really big impact on flavour. And some of my previous work in sort of food ingredient development has looked at malt extracts. They are specialist products without which many of our favourite foods would probably not be what they are today. Okay, I'll move on to say a little bit about global malt production. And it's estimated annually across the world, 24 million tonnes are produced. It's hard to estimate exactly, but 24 million is a reasonable estimate. And this is a growing amount. It's certainly expected, and the predictions are that it will grow substantially in the next 10 years. And the reasons for that are the growth in developing countries and emerging markets, premiumization of products, so beer, which contains more malt and less adjunct, and also the growth of the craft sector. And the growth of the craft sector doesn't only just grow from itself, but it encourages bigger brewers to move into more specialized products. And we're really seeing a boom in particular areas. So the malting industry in the UK, it consists of 18 malting companies, of which 11 are members of Magb. They operate across 36 total production sites, of which 11 are in, so 21 production sites in Scotland, which are from 11 companies. Annually, the total amount of barley that's used is in the region of 2 million tonnes, and that's to produce 1.6 million tonnes of malt. So the major customers are whisky distillers, which is taking about 50% of the tonnage, and the remainder is for beer, 37%, export around about 11%, and food 2%. And that's been a dramatic change in the last decade. Beer used to be the big sort of big customer for UK malt, and now it's whisky. So that's the map of the English malting sites, and these are all sites which are members of Magb. This is actually available on our website if anyone wants to see it. And you'll see that most of the malting companies tend to be down the eastern side of the country, and that's a reflection of the fact it's where the barley tends to be grown. So there is a real advantage in being close to the source of barley. There's a cluster in East Anglia, Norfolk, Suffolk and Essex, and you see Warminster's down there in the south, it's most southerly, and in Wiltshire. You've got Soufflé across in Burton-on-Trent, which is sort of former Molten Cause maltings, and then up in Yorkshire there's a cluster of maltings. And then you've got Scotland, and the Simpsons plant is actually just in England, but given that most of the customers for that plant are in Berwick-on-Tweed, I included it on the Scottish map. There's a cluster of maltings on up on the Moray Firth, and that's very much a reflection of the fact that they're delivering into a lot of the local distilleries. There are a number of maltings on Islay. I've just marked one on here. There are a number of other floor maltings, and there's a floor maltings on Orkney, and then there's a few sort of further down the east of the country. So a brief mention about exports, and actually there is one change to this map, which is the very large red in the top, which is Russia is no longer a customer. So around 170,000 tonnes was exported in 2021 to over 50 countries in most regions of the world, and this has been higher in the past. And what tends to happen is there tends to be an excess of malt which is exported. The majority of malt is used for domestic brewing and whisky production. So although the tonnage is relatively low, 170,000 tonnes out of 1.6 million tonnes, for some smaller maltsters who are making specialist malts, particularly things like coloured malts, this is actually a pretty important part of their business. And the two major destinations for malt by tonnage are the United States and Japan, driven by the demand for craft ales and Japanese whisky. So it really is the reputation of British malt which is driving the demand, and there is considerable scope to deliver more for exports if more malt becomes available. I must mention sustainability, since there have been many advances in energy efficiency and water conservation across the maltings. This was a subject of a previous seminar, which is available on the IBH website. So maltsters have switched where it's been possible to do so to renewables, and they are seeking towards minimizing carbon emissions towards net zero targets, and a large amount of that is working with barley suppliers, because 60% of the carbon in the malt is actually within the supply of barley. Some examples of some of the initiatives: so most maltsters have moved away from solid fuels, things like anthracite, to gas, and where gas is used, often this is used in a combined heat and power plant to make more efficient use of the gas supplies. There's a lot of heat recovery systems, and most kilns are fired indirectly, so the use of extremely efficient glass tube heat exchangers for heat transfer efficiency. A number of maltings have installed anaerobic digestion plants, often with biogas. And many of these improvements have helped the malting sector achieve its targets in the climate change agreements, which is a scheme in which all malting companies participate. So I recommend Nigel's seminar, which is on the IBH, to get more detail. Okay, it's a bit about malting. So I'll talk about the Magb and how we're helping the sector. So the origin of the Magb is a long one. It goes back to 1827, and it was all about money, all about taxation, to be specific. So the malt tax was introduced in 1644, and it was intended to help pay for the English Civil War. It was extended to Scotland some years later in 1713, and it went down like a lead balloon. In 1725, there were Malt Tax Riots, and I found a history book, and I quote: "In Glasgow, enraged citizens drove out the military and burned the home of their MP." These weren't happy times for maltsters. So the Magb formed, and it started small, and it was brought in to remove the punitive clauses in the malt tax, and it quickly gained in popularity, and it grew to 1,800 members. And in 1880, the association achieved its goal, and the duty was taken off malt, and it was placed on beer. So you can imagine that was popular with maltsters, but not so popular with brewers. So today, here we are. We've got 11 members, but we do represent 98% of malt production, and we do still lobby government on financial issues. So we have a much broader agenda today, and this is our mission statement. So to promote and safeguard the UK malting industry, so enabling it to fulfil its worldwide potential. In recent years, there's been a much greater need to keep our voice heard in government circles, and we feel we can't take malting for granted. So these are two events. The top one is actually cereals. So we're often trying to work with farmers and trying to work with the supply chain. And the bottom one is our annual lunch in Armourers Hall in London, which has not happened for the last 2 years of the pandemic, but we're scheduled to return to normal in this November. And this is where we entertain suppliers and customers. So this is how we structure our activities. We have two main committees: a technical committee and a trade committee. And next week we meet face to face for the first time in 2 years in a spring meeting round, which is absolutely fantastic. Governance is through an executive committee, which comprises of representatives from each of our member companies, and a number of subgroups exist under the technical and trade committees. One of particular importance and relevance to most people around on this presentation would be the Malting Barley Committee. So we run that on behalf of the sort of a number of organisations, and that's joined with Scotch Whisky Association, the brewers, the plant breeders, and AHDB. So there's much information about the Malting Barley Committee and other activities on our website. So these are some of the key areas of our work. So they're all important, but I'll highlight just a few of them. So I mean, supporting trade is still a really important part of what we do, and we work extremely closely with government, with governments, I should say, to ensure that malting is not compromised in any trade deals that are developed. Food safety has always been a key area, and we operate our own bespoke due diligence program on behalf of the sector. And we also liaise very closely with the Food Standards Agency and the Food Standards Scotland to ensure that new legislation is both proportionate and achievable. We operate our own quality assurance scheme for malt, the Assured UK Malt, and we offer our own training and exams for those that are entering the industry. We've recently set up a skills forum, and we had the first meeting 2 weeks ago. And this is one of the activities which we've recognised. We need to reach out to colleges and universities to highlight malting as a career. We see the task of attracting people to work in the malting industry as one of our main focus areas in coming months and coming years. So lastly on the list is the cereal supply chain. And without growers to deliver the 2 million tons of barley, and I would say the majority of that barley is domestically produced. Without that, we would struggle to be as successful as we are today. So this is a long list of activities, and we couldn't do this alone. So I'll just mention some of the organisations that we work with. They're on the slide here. This is just a sample actually, and I have to say the pandemic has actually made it slightly easier because we can get around people more quickly. But we're now coming back to face, which is also really good. Okay, so what of the future? Well, I feel the future is good for British malt, and I think we have a positive message for our suppliers and our customers. And it won't be without challenges, but we're in good shape when we can meet these challenges. And there are some really exciting developments on the horizon. There's a new Moltings in Inverness, or new Moltings on the Baird site in Inverness, due to open later this year, with extra production. And there's a new Moltings planned by Simpsons on Speyside, and you could find more information about that on the Simpsons website. And there are also new opportunities in plant breeding technologies, which I think could be very interesting for the future. So, as a member of the International Barley Hub and as a supporter for the Collaborative Training Partnership, and we have a PhD that we're sponsoring under the Baritone Programme, we're really looking forward to working together with a number of people around the table here. So, finally, thanks for everyone for listening. And I'll just make an acknowledgement to our members, and particularly those who supplied some of the slides and the material for the talk. If you need more information, our website is absolutely packed with information, or you can just email me, and you'll find our email addresses on the website. So thanks for listening.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Julian, and thank you very much for your presentation. We have some questions coming in, so I think we'll go to Robbie first. Robbie, do you want to ask your questions yourself, and you want me to read them out?
I can ask them.
Right, thank you.
I didn't know that this Irish brewer used whole grain. I guess it'll be kilned and ground whole grain in their brewing process. Does that have any consequence on alcohol content, or is it just flavour and mouthfeel and texture?
Oh, Robbie, that's an easy one. The amount of whole grain, the roasted barley, is a relatively small proportion, because the colour, if you look at the colour is in huge numbers compared to the amount of colour in normal sort of pale malt. So by far the majority of the grist for the Irish stout is from for all Irish stouts is from pale malt. So there's mostly malted cereals going in. It's just the small percent of a very dark coloured unmalted is it produces incredible colours. So it's just very concentrated. but only a small.
Does it contribute at all to the alcohol or anything, or is it
No.
just
Well,
so
if
it's
it
just
does,
flavour and texture?
if it does, it would be exceptionally minor. I guess there's a tiny amount if you really wanted to search for it, but it's almost all for flavour and colour.
Okay.
Robbie, I think your next question that you've got flows quite nicely into that one. So I'll take your next question as well, Robbie, next.
Okay, I'm not sure if you managed to join the last seminar we had, Julian, from Pat Hayes. But Pat talked about research on flavour compounds that were coming through. And can you take another question? That's just my doorbell going. I'll be back in a second.
Okay, right. Okay. Luke, we'll go to your question. To what extent does barley variety used impact on the malting process now? So barley varieties, Julian.
But I mean, choosing the right barley variety is essential, and every year you know we've got new barley varieties coming around on a regular basis, and each of those goes through obviously the national list and then recommended list, and they're trialed on a micro malting basis, and then they're trialed on a full scale plant basis before they can go into approval on the approval system, and all varieties will behave slightly differently in terms of things like water uptake and you know, germination characteristics. So I mean, barley variety pretty much all maltsters will trial new season's crop. It's not just barley variety, but the different crops, the different years will give you different performance. So I mean, one of the exciting things about malting, in a sense, is that you know, no two barley crops are the same. And so barley variety is really important, and I'll take that one step further, which is a lot of customers, brewers or distillers might specify the variety because they know that variety will operate efficiently and in their process and produce the product that they require. So barley variety really important.
So could I ask a follow-on question?
Yeah.
Go on, Luke.
It's just so, I mean, given the scale of the operation, so how often would you like to change your variety? I mean, once you've got the setup right.
A large distiller once said to me, he said that one of the bane of his life was the fact that the barley variety was changing all the time, and he was constantly trialing in his distillery. I mean, the barley variety is likely to be outclassed agronomically long before it's outclassed in terms of its distilling performance or brewing performance. So as long as possible.
Just a follow-up question on that one, Julian. Do you think we'll ever get to a wee bit like the wine industry, where you have the grape changes every year? So you have a specific year, and sometimes you have a good year, and sometimes you have a poorer year. Do you think we'll ever get to that situation within malt?
Well, I think some people feel there's a terroir already for their malt, and I mean, you know, the Maris Otter story is phenomenal, and but you know, with a large global product is a different matter. I think there will be. I think the changes will be quite subtle. It'd be very difficult to just you know, to analytically determine whether there are real differences.
The good thing is that
good marketing story though.
Yeah. The good thing within the International Barley Hub is we're part of the equipment we're putting in, and Joanne's got a project going just now, and we're actually going to put in a micro malting so that we can actually do some of that work at Hutton as well. Like so, that's one of the things that we see a big advantage in the International Barley Hub is having that.
That's great.
That we didn't have before. Right.
That's great. Because I was going to say maltsters spend a lot of August and September, October, November trialing barley varieties for that coming season. They do. I mean, every year there's a difference.
Okay. Just when we're on barleys, I'm going to go to Malcolm now. And Malcolm, you've asked what percentage of malting barley is spring and winter. So we've talked about the varieties. Is there any difference between spring and winter, and what percentage are we using?
Yeah, this is a good question. And I mean, spring barley is still the favoured crop for malting, because hot water extracts from spring barley are, you know, are will supersede those for winter barley, because we had the Inframalt project, which was trying to put a spring barley into a winter type spring character into a winter barley, and ultimately there would be real benefits to be able to do that. But I mean, at the moment, the majority is spring. I think we've got figures on our website off the top of my head. We might be talking something like 80%.
Is Maris Otter your main winter variety then?
It's Maris Otter is, yeah, it's pretty. It's I've got figures here for 2020 crop Maris Otter 31,000 tons. So I mean, it's pretty big actually as a winter crop. Yeah.
Is that the same in America, North America?
Sorry, I can't comment on that, Robbie. I don't know.
There might be somebody in the audience that could.
Yeah. Is there anybody within us from America that can comment on the use of winter to spring varieties for malting?
Tom?
Yeah, winter barleys, in my experience, tend to not germinate as uniformly as springs do, and that's, I think, the reason why our industry prefers springs.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just looking at our figures here. So Craft, which is a brewing winter, was 80,000 tons in 2020. So there is a good market for winter barleys, but we really need that spring character to be bred into a winter variety.
So my calculation there is that between Craft and Maris Otter, it's only 5% of the total 2 million ton. Is my maths right?
Yeah, you've got Flagon coming in as well. So
okay, right.
24,000 tons. So you have got some others. You probably got about double that. You might have about 10%.
Yeah. I mean, from the farming perspective, it certainly would spread the workload, and it certainly would help in a fair bit if we could get this Inframalt, what we're trying to do in Inframalt, get the spring gene into the winter gene. That would help us a great deal. Like, so yeah.
Yeah, my understanding is that the breeders have taken up some of that output of that project, and we will in time see some new varieties coming through with winter varieties.
Good. Robbie, do you want to do your flavour one now and put your doorbell on mute?
I've just had a phone call as well, actually. Did nobody ask it?
No, on you go.
All right. So in the last seminar we heard about research on flavour from Pat Hayes in Oregon State. And the question really is, are the UK maltsters and brewers at all interested in flavour compounds derived from the barley grain? Or is the focus more on maintaining a standard processing environment? So is grain-derived flavour considered important?
Wow.
So it's varietal flavour.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to put your finger on. It's a difficult area, because if you consider beer flavour and the number of different contributors to beer flavour, and there are people that would consider hops being the main contributor, but malt is the primary ingredient in beer, so it has to contribute to flavour significantly. And but I mean, if all being equal, if you took two varieties, I'm sure you could probably analytically determine that one had a different flavour profile to the other, but whether that would be significant in the final product is another question. And I mean, you find a malt, a barley variety and a malt type that you find works well for your product, and you stick with it if you want to keep your flavors standardized. I think there is an interest in flavor, but it's a hard one to chase. And there is work, and I know there's work at SWRI as well on flavour contribution from barley varieties into whiskey.
Yeah, I've had the pleasure, I guess, of tasting some of Pat's taste tests, which she did with Sierra Nevada. I know there's others on this call as well that have been part of these trials, but it was actually quite difficult to tell differences, I have to say, but they were there. You just couldn't identify what actually was that was different about them. So
Yeah.
I mean, there's definitely something there. I
Yeah.
would say from my own experience.
Yeah, I mean, if you consider the differences between different, different malting processes, you've got different differences in your source barley, even the same variety grown on under different regimes on
Absolutely.
different farms. So there are so many different variables. It's very hard to make a comparison unless you can really control all of those other variables. I mean, the kilning produces a very significant amount of flavour in malt. And the question is that going to, that may override any differences you may get from different varieties. So I think there's a good story there if you can pin all the variables.
I agree.
Okay, so I'm going to take a question from Tom Mulholland. Julian, what is the role of the MBC scheme that the MGBA organised? How long has it been running?
Can you tell us what it is first?
Malt and
What's
Barley.
MBC?
Malt and Barley Committee.
Yeah. So this this is fun. This is the scheme that in terms of how long it's been running. Off the top of my head, I'm afraid I don't know, but I suspect it's on our website. But this is a scheme whereby new varieties are trialled for approval for brewing and distilling, and this is the I can show you so that's the publication. So that goes on our website every year. So this has taken new varieties that are coming through the AHDB recommended list and putting them through the paces in micro malting, full scale brewing, and full scale distilling trials. So this is funded by the brewers, the distillers, and the maltsters. And we meet twice a year. We meet actually. The next meeting is the 25th of May in Edinburgh, and we decide on what the new varieties that will go on the list will be for the next season. And it's incredibly detailed, the amount of work that goes into approving these. And when I say full scale trials, I mean some of these are full scale production. And if you go onto our website, there's a whole section on MBC, Malt and Barley Committee, and it goes into great detail. It has all of the protocols and everything. It's an incredibly important part of the development of varieties going into malting and to brewing. And it's what every farmer will be looking to every year to see what's worth growing for the next season. It dictates what goes in the soil.
And I mean, again, these are run in conjunction with HDB and NL and RL trials as well. So we're looking at that and seeing what reliable varieties are there and what traits are there, and then they go through the malting process as well to see where they're of malting quality as well. So there's a fair bit of research done in these once the varieties come to market. Or near market, there's a fair bit of research done with these so that the farmer gets better information. But also from your side, the maltster gets better information as well.
Yeah. I would say also that there are varieties that are grown that are not on the MBC list. I mean, Maris Otter is a main example of that. So you can have a successful variety that doesn't even go through or is no longer on the MBC list, and if there's a market, then it will get grown and it will get more.
The resurgence of Golden Promise as well, Julian, is another example of an outclassed variety that had a niche market, so was able to enter into the niche market.
Yeah. I would say one of the difficulties as well is that some of the newer a niche variety, for example, that would come through with a novel character, let's say here something that would require much less input. Remember that everything that goes into the MBC list has been grown through a standardized agronomic profile sort of schedule. So it's really hard to get a variety in which has got a unique character, because these are ranked on performance, which is generally based on hot water extract or predicted spirit yield. So there is a lot of discussion at the moment as to how we can open up that list to more niche varieties.
Good. This is an excellent question from Ruth. What percentage of staff in the malting industry are skilled, highly skilled, and are there enough people being trained for the high-level jobs?
I love that question. That's a great question. Personally, people in the malt. I mean, if I said there's around about 800 people employed in the malting industry in total, so it's not a big employer. But what you do find is a lot of people come into malting and they find a career where they can develop their skills right from the bottom. And there are notable cases of people that came in, years ago as a tea boy and then ended up as a president or a managing director. It's a really good industry for training and development. There's a high proportion of people are in the middle skills, so a lot of engineers, quite a lot of salespeople, quite a lot of people involved in the supply chain, buying barley, involved. So there's a real mix of skills. I mean, the laboratories, you're employing from technicians through to sort of more senior scientific staff, but none of these are huge, but they are quite specialised. And one of the things the malting industry seeks to do is basically to go out and say to people, look, we're here. We need to employ people coming in, which is why we were so interested in the collaborative training partnership, because it's a really good opportunity for us to, sort of pull on the next sort of talent that's out there. But if you look around the malting industry, I mean, there's a lot of people going to retire in the next 10 years, as there will be with most of the food industry. So we're going to be where we need to attract the right people.
Good. Just a comment here from Callum. Luke, there's some good work going on at Heriot Watt. I think the two of you need to link up and have a wee chat about that. That's following on from Luke's question. So Callum's just put that we have a number of projects in this area at Heriot Watt. Happy to discuss of interest. Callum might be happy to discuss as well, maybe a future talk and some of the work you're doing there as well. So I'll let you link it up with Donna or Robbie on that one, because it sounds interesting there.
George, can I just say that we're sponsoring a PhD, co-sponsoring a PhD at Heriot Watt, and that's work on coloured malts used for distilling, is in conjunction with Chris Malt and with Holyrood Distillery. I think it's in its fourth year now. So, but Callum, I'm very keen to talk about further work and love to do that.
And I've just got a thumbs up from Callum to say that he will be one of our speakers in the future. So Robbie or Donna will be in touch, Callum, to get that one. Now, Barbara, I've got my question is similar to yourself. So I'm going to read out your question first and then my question. Do you think new variety uptake might increase in speed with the push towards net zero and the amount of emissions from barley supply chains, a better performing barley? And I've got, my question is, what should future breeders seek to develop for the maltsters in new malting varieties? So I'll put these two together, Julian, and just, what we're looking for new varieties, and what should the breeders be looking to do to try and help in that as well?
Okay. Yeah. Firstly, we need new varieties which have got good agronomic and good disease resistance with minimal inputs. I think one of the challenges is as producing a malting barley with less nitrogen or application and also with less in terms of disease. It's at the moment it's I mean the costs for a farmer are going in the wrong direction, and so barleys which have got low agricultural inputs would be good, because, as I said, 60% of our carbon is in growing the barley, mostly of it in the fertilizer if it's ammonium nitrate. So you need a variety with good germination, even corn size, good water uptake, good hydration, and good vigorous germination. I mean these things are not really any different from what we've been asking, but I think the low agricultural inputs are. It's difficult because the trialling system, the AHDB trialling system, and the national list is based on high yield. We need high yield, but we also need some of the other characters. So it's a big discussion at the next Malting Barley Committee in a few weeks' time.
Yeah, the one thing that the NL and RL have now got is the untreated, which gives you a comparison so that you can actually see a variety that maybe stands up a little bit better to disease and things like that, with not the full chemical getting thrown at it. So we need to I agree with you. Yield's not king now. We need to look at other. We need to look at other traits that give us better agronomic qualities within it as well. And
Yeah,
if we can get a nitrogen at £700 a tonne at the present moment, Julian, if we can get a variety that we can grow at half the nitrogen, Robbie, take note. That certainly would be the big panacea at the present moment, like, because it would reduce our cost by half immediately. So yeah.
yeah, and I think another character that I would add to that list is something that would withstand sort of climate variability. And at the moment, we're looking at a very dry England and very parts of Scotland as well. But I mean, there hasn't been any rain to speak of for many weeks down south.
Yeah, you want to come up to my area just now. We've had 2 days of lovely rain, and the place is looking wall to wall green at the present moment, Julian. So we're sitting here, rubbing our hands at the present moment. So yeah, Callum, thank you very much for that information, and I'm sure we'll follow up on that publication. My final question, Julian, is you showed that malt extract for food production was only 5% of the malt that was being used. Do you see that as an upcoming market, or do you see that as a decreasing market?
Well, I would hope that that's a growing market, because there's a lot of opportunity for using malt to reduce things like sugar and salt. As a flavour enhancer, malt has got almost like a magical impact on some foods, and I mean it's used worldwide, and I mean there's a lot of brands out there that would cease to exist if we couldn't get any malt extracts. Not just the ones on the slide that I showed, but many others as well as a hidden ingredient in many foods. So I think there's an opportunity there for food manufacturers more generally to pick up more use malt extract as a to help reduce some of the other things that they're trying to reduce in food. So I think it's a growing market.
Okay. Final question. Where do you see most of your work going in the next year or so, Julian, from MAGB?
That's a good final question, actually. Yeah. Well, firstly, we want to increase people to come and work in the sector. There's been a lot of retirements, and there's a lot of change, and we need people. We need younger people to come into the sector at the bottom. That's going to be a big one. We're going to be going out there to talk to colleges and universities and sort of looking at apprenticeships and so on. Secondly, we have to help the sector achieve its environmental goals, and there are some challenging goals out there, not just net zero, but other areas. I mean, things like there's a new climate change agreement scheme under development by the government, and we sit on groups that are helping to shape that. There's a lot of opportunity with things like developing hydrogen power and other renewables. So we try and coordinate those opportunities across the sector. The other one is the supply chain. We need a strong supply chain, and we work closely with the farming unions, AHDB, and others in the agriculture sector to really encourage people to grow malt and barley, because we can't take that as a given. And with the changes in agriculture, we need to make sure we're working together. And on one particular area, I'd add to those other things, is that we're working on a digital grain passport at the moment. So trying to digitize some of the supply chain, which is a challenge, and it's a really big project for the next. You're probably aware of it, is for the next 3 years. So there's a lot happening. I haven't even mentioned food safety, and we work with monitor mycotoxins, and we're working with Food Standards Agency to develop their new regulatory system. So those are some of the challenges. There are many more, but those are the ones that I would put at the top of my list.
Yep, I certainly back your food safety one. Food security is something that we didn't have on the radar probably right even up till before Christmas, but what's happened in the last 3 months has certainly opened their eyes to show what can actually happen when something major like what's happening in Ukraine there. So food security is a big one, and we can produce the malt in Scotland. Sorry, I'll say UK there, not Scotland, but yes, it seems a good way forward. Julian, as ever, thank you very much. I've known you for quite a while now, and I haven't been disappointed again today. And I've probably learnt something about the malting that I didn't know before. Excellent talk and really informative. So thank you very much, Julian, for your time and for your contribution, and also for your support in International Barley Hub as well. It is very much appreciated. We want to show a virtual clap to Julian for his talk today.